host talking about what exactly when we talk about reparations, what exactly are we talking about, and then we're going to get into some more information about what's happening across the Caribbean, and then finally to the Grenada situation as in terms of reparations. So what exactly are reparations? So reparations, the intent or the purpose of reparations, it's intended to repair causes and consequences of human rights violations. So reparations are used as a means of restorative justice, restoring justice in cases where human rights have been violated. Right? So slavery is an example where human rights were violated in the sense that West Africans, millions of West Africans, were taken by force. They did not give consent. They were taken by force and transported across the Atlantic Sea and brought to the Caribbean and also North America. Both the Canada and US also had slaves too as well. So that in itself is an act of human rights violations. Slavery still exists today, not so much the West African style of slavery, but slavery in other parts of the world where people are enslaved against their right, their consent to live a free life. Right? So that's the purpose of reparations. It's a form of transitional or restorative justice in which persons who have experienced or their descendants, because if we're talking slavery, we're talking more the descendants of the slaves like ourselves, because we are not enslaved, but definitely our ancestors were, our great grandparents were many generations back, were enslaved as part of the slavery and the slave trade that took place in the 1700s and the 1600s that really brought wealth to Europe in the form of the export of sugar, mostly sugar, to a lesser extent cotton and coffee, but mostly sugar was the main product that was exported to Europe, and that really created wealth for UK or Britain, which is our mother country, France, Spain, and Holland. So the purpose of reparations are to repair that damage, the damage that was done because of the violation of human rights. And if we're talking about the Caribbean context and definitely the Grenadian context, we are talking about slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and the existence of sugar plantations in Grenada in which slaves were had to work and endure long hours of labor to produce sugar to export to Europe. And there were plantation owners, and those plantation owners were European descent. Good night, Veronica. Sandy, thank you for taking in the program tonight. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Island Learning Grenada as we unpack what exactly are reparations. So, who exactly have a right to reparation? So, the right to reparation or some form of restorative justice, restoring justice to those who have been impacted by acts of human rights violation, the victims themselves, if they are alive, or the victims, not themselves, in this case, in terms of the Grenada context or the Caribbean context, we would be descendants of the victims, because we're not enslaved right now, so we're no longer victims, but our descendants were direct victims. We still today are impacted, because as many would argue, both on the economic side and the historical side, would argue that the our economic situation in Grenada and the Caribbean are impacted due to the what was slavery and the impact that it's had. So our economic conditions today, in terms of education, health, housing, social welfare, continue to be impacted because of the slave trade and what slavery did to the islands. So victims of human rights violations have a right to reparation. And in this case, it also extends to the ancestors or the descendants of victims can also claim that right to reparation. It is a legal right. It is a legal right that victims or the descendants of victims have to reparation, and that is driven by of course, the United Nations and the policies and philosophy of the United Nations. Victims of human rights violations have that right. And then the violators themselves, those who have done wrong, who are believed to have done wrong in committing acts of violation of human rights, they have a legal right to provide reparations. We're going to talk a little bit more about what exactly reparations could be in various forms. But those who have done wrong, certainly they have a legal right to provide reparations, either to the victims themselves or to the descendants, if they can claim lineage. They can get something, right? They could get that, whatever the reparations are. Right, so that's a bit of context there. So let's get into the types of reparations. The most popular form of reparation is compensation, and definitely in terms of the current Caribbean context and the current Grenada situation, two types are being offered by the family who's going to be here in Grenada on February 27th. The first one is compensation. So compensation is basically money. Payment of monies to the victims or the descendants of victims. That's one form of restorative justice, or one form of reparation, giving the victims or the family members of the victims, their descendants, money, some form of compensation, as a source of sorry, apology, commemoration for what took place, the acts of violation that took place. So that's one type. As I said, it's the most common type, but there are other types of reparation. There is what's called a public apology, which is the violator or those who have done wrong make a formal apology. So that too is going to happen on February 27th. The family that's going to be in Grenada, the traveling family, they have already issued a formal letter of public apology for their participation in the slavery and the enslavement of the over 1,000 slaves across 6 plantations in Grenada. So that's the second type of reparation, a public apology, a formal apology, acknowledging the wrong and essentially saying that you're sorry, you acknowledge the wrong, and you apologizing for the act that has been done. So that's the second type. There's also memorial, so a memorial that is held to honor the victims or the families of the victims or the descendants who have been impacted directly due to the human rights violation. That is also another type of reparation. So you could hold a memorial, and that's something is another type. And then also commemorations. Commemorations are another type of reparation, and that's usually in the form of a formal ceremony, again, where there is the honoring of the victims or the families of the victims and their descendants. So these are some examples of the more common types of reparation or restorative justice that can be done whenever there are these acts of human rights violations. Slavery, of course, being the one that we're talking about in this context here in terms of Grenada and the Caribbean. To date, the transatlantic slave trade and the slavery itself is probably the most catastrophic or torturous act of human rights violation that humans on this side of the world have experienced. We also talk about the indigenous people, so the Amerindians who lived before on the islands. They too experienced torture. Many of them were killed. For example, in Grenada, hundreds of Caribs lost their lives as they had to jump off the cliff at Lepers Hill, St. Patrick's. So that's another act of human rights violation. In Dominica, you can talk about the Calinagos there. They too have experienced acts of human rights violation. And in fact, I believe there's also claims being made to see if they can get some kind of reparation monies for those acts of violations that have been done against the Calinagos on the island of Dominica. So, in terms of the Grenada and Caribbean context, as I said, slavery. So there is both compensation, but then also what is called symbolic means of reparation. So let's take a short break here, and then we'll be right back to continue, of course, with what we're talking about here today in terms of reparation. So let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Right, so we are right back to the program. So I hope during this the break there, you continue to hit the share button and share the live. Of course, if you're watching the program for the first time and you want to stay updated or in tune to our program, ensure that you hit the follow button so you can follow our Facebook page. You can also like our Facebook page, Island Learning Grenada. So either one of the two actions we will be most appreciated. So you can follow the Facebook page Island Learning Grenada, as well as you can like us on Facebook, Island Learning Grenada. So I'm seeing some mad faces. I know the topic today is very heavy. Reparations is a very heavy topic. It can be an emotional topic because we're talking about the impact that slavery has had, and it's the first time for a lot of people to really sit and really to to really reflect upon what has been done or what has been done to our ancestors many years ago and still today impacts our lives in some way, shape, and form. So it's a very heavy topic, and it's one that we've been silent on for many, many years. And it's good now that we're getting into reparations and the payment of compensation, to really have that dialogue and begin to have those open conversations about what really the impact of slavery and the slave trade have had upon the Caribbean, upon Grenada, economically and socially, right? And today we are still recovering from those impacts. So it's a very heavy topic. So definitely not something to be taken lightly at all. And it's a discussion to be a general conversation and dialogue to be have among Grenadians, among Caribbean people. So let's get into the Caribbean situation. So the Caribbean situation, based on research, there was an estimated 5.5 million Africans who were brought from across West Africa and transported to the Caribbean islands over a period of 180 years, right? 5.5 million Africans. So that's a lot of people. A lot of people who came over almost 2 centuries. 180 years is almost 2 centuries. They were uprooted from their lives, from their families in West Africa, and brought by force upon slave ships. They were packed as sardines on slave ships and brought to the Caribbean, to Grenada, to a place they did not know, and forced to work long, hard labor on sugar plantations to grow sugar cane, harvest the sugar cane, and package the raw sugar for export to the UK, France, Spain, and Holland. So it's a lot. So slavery itself, the act to end slavery, was passed in 1833, and the slaves themselves, freedom came in 1834, 1 year after the act was passed, and then they went through a period of 4 years of apprenticeship, right, which was a mild form of keeping them enslaved. They still had to work on the sugar plantation, but it was not as rigorous as the days of slavery itself. So officially in 1838, full emancipation was achieved in 1838 for slaves. Our ancestors got their full freedom in August 1838. Now, when slavery was ended, the slave owners, the plantation owners, they walked away with compensation. They were compensated by the Parliament of Britain at the time. So across the Caribbean, 20 million pounds were provided in compensation to slave owners, plantation owners, those who owned sugar estates in Grenada, and there were many sugar estates. We had Grand Bras, we had numerous ones, right, on across Grenada and the Caribbean in total. I'm not sure what the amount that Grenadian plantation owners received, but across the Caribbean it was 20 million pounds, and most of that monies came from bonds. So the government of Britain at the time, they took out bonds to be able to pay that compensation. It's actually, I think it was in 2015, those bonds were finally repaid, so they're just coming out of still paying back from slavery. But anyways, 20 million pounds. That's what the slave owners or the plantation owners received. It is estimated that a total of 800,000 slaves were freed throughout the Caribbean. So just under 1 million slaves got their freedom in 1838 when emancipation came in full effect. The freed slaves received no monies. So quite a difference in terms of the plantation owners. They received compensation, but the freed slaves, they received absolutely $0 upon their freedom. They were freed, they were able to go into society and enter into what is called the post-emancipation period. That's the period that after slavery, it's the post-emancipation period, and they were able to start their lives as free people, but with no monies from Britain, or no monies were provided by the plantation owners who did receive monies. They gave their freed slaves no monies to begin their lives. The total sum paid, and this is what is believed, the $20 million that was paid in compensation to plantation owners, that money today would be worth 1.7 billion EC dollars. So if you were to convert over time, and of course the economists would tell you that money grows over time, that money today would be 1.7 billion dollars. So I think the budget that was delivered for the Grenada budget was about 1 point something billion dollars, right? So if you were to get all the money, the 20 million, just Grenada alone will be able to cover the budget money. But anyways, we won't get into that. But that's the total sum of the 20 million pounds. In today's money, it would be 1.7 billion EC dollars. So just want to plug again, if you're watching on YouTube, ensure that you hit the subscribe button and stay subscribed to all our content on either Learning Grenada, and of course turn on your notification so that you can get notified every time that we go live on a Sunday. So let's continue with the Caribbean situation. So in the Caribbean, it's not that we've been sitting down not doing anything about this case for reparation. There has been some efforts to bring to light the reparation and to pursue it. So the first step to pursue reparation was the formation in 2013 of the Caribbean Reparations Commission. So in July 2013, at the 34th meeting of the heads of government across the Caribbean, a committee dedicated to the pursuit of reparation was set up. That commission is called the Caribbean Reparations Commission, and today it is chaired by Professor Hilary Beckles of the University of the West Indies. Professor Hilary Beckles will be in Grenada on February 27th to participate in that event, in which there's going to be the official apology and also monies handed over by the traveling family as reparation for their role in slavery. So that Reparation Commission, the purpose of it, to establish the moral, ethical, and legal case for the payment of reparations by the former colonial powers to Caribbean people for transatlantic slavery, chattel slavery, and native genocide of the Amerindian population. So that's what the intent of that commission, right? To really seek out payment from our colonial powers. So across the Caribbean, there are 4 colonial powers: UK, France, Spain, and Holland. So those are the big 4 colonial powers we're talking about here. And it's those monies are being sought for acts of violation, because that's what reparation is. Acts of violation due to the transatlantic slavery, so the bringing across slaves from West Africa to the Caribbean, chattel slavery, which is the basically enslaving people by force upon sugar plantations, and then the genocide of the Amerindian population, because they were the first slaves and many of them died. That's why they had to bring the West Africans in the first place, right? The Caribs and the Awaks, they died because they couldn't endure the hardship of what was chattel slavery. So the West Africans who were stronger in physical body and strength replaced them. So the genocide of the Amerindian population. So that's the purpose and intent of the CARICOM Reparation Commission. So CARICOM has developed a 10-point plan on reparations. So they have a 10-point plan. I'm just going to highlight a few points out 4 out of the 10 points. If you want to learn more, you can always Google and check out the CARICOM 10-point plan on reparation. So basically, as part of that plan, CARICOM wants 10 things. I'm just going to highlight 4. The first one, of course, is a symbolic measure of reparation, which is a full formal apology. So the UK and Holland and Spain and France apologizing formally for their role and involvement in slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and the genocide of the Amerindian population. So that's the first one. And as I said, apology is the most symbolic. It is meant to just say sorry and apologize for the wrongs that have been done. So that's one thing the CARICOM Reparation Commission is seeking, a full formal apology. The second one is debt cancellation. So basically, canceling all debts that the Caribbean islands owe to these colonial powers, whether it's debt through loans, through bonds, monies that have been borrowed for the economic stability and sustenance of the Caribbean islands. We want all those monies cancelled out. No debt, full debt cancellation, so that it frees up our economy. We don't have to keep paying all these monies every month, right? Debt cancellation, canceling debt so that our economy can breathe and we don't have to keep repaying debt to these colonial powers. So that also is being asked, that debt cancellation. The third one is technology transfer, which is essentially helping the islands to become more developed technology-wise, and transferring some of the technical knowledge, technology knowledge that these more developed countries, UK, Britain, France, and Holland, have, and transfer it into the Caribbean islands, whether it's technical assistance, whether it's equipment, whether it's technology supporting dollars, but technology transfer. And then the last one I'm going to highlight here is cultural institutions. So supporting cultural institutions, the establishment of cultural institutions, whether or not it is like a museum that will focus on educating people on slavery, right? But some kind of establishment of cultural institutions that would be paid for by the colonial powers and established across the Caribbean islands. So those are some of the highlights of that 10-point plan that CARICOM has, and the CARICOM Reparation Commission is seeking to get from our former masters and their descendants, etc. As I mentioned, Professor Hilary Beckles of the University of the West Indies currently chairs that CARICOM Reparation Committee. So we're going to take a quick break here, and then we'll be right back and get more into the Grenada situation. So of course, during the break, hit the share button if you have not hit it as yet, and share the program so we can reach a wider audience. Right, and we're back. So good night. Let's say a quick good night to Donna, Robert, Alexis. Thank you for tuning into the program. Hope that you're finding it very informative. So good night to you. Of course, we also want to continue to shout out Pineapple Marketing and Communications for bringing the show on their Facebook page. If you are a small business owner, please do check out Pineapple Marketing and Communications and see their packages for marketing and promoting your small business. So let's continue with the program. So we're still talking the Caribbean situation. So lastly, in terms of what the Caribbean is continuing to do to pursue reparation, the CARICOM Reparations Committee, they have hired a law firm to pursue a legal case against Britain for reparation. So there is a lawsuit that is focusing on claiming reparation for the impact of the slave trade on the Caribbean. The law firm that is being used is the same law firm that was used by Kenya, because Kenya is a success example of a African country who pursued a legal case against Britain for reparation. There was decades ago torture of many Kenyans, and they received compensation through legal means from Britain. So that's the same law firm that the Caribbean is using in their legal case to pursue reparation compensation from Britain. Right? So they've put forward a lawsuit against Britain, Holland, and France for reparation. So in the Caribbean, we're not sitting down. Definitely, we're pursuing through legal means to get reparations. So let's go on to the Grenada situation quickly. Of course, follow our Facebook page if you like our content. Make sure you hit the follow and like Island Learning Grenada. So let's talk about the Grenada situation. So it was last year, in 2022, that this story broke about the traveling family, and a first trip was made by a British reporter. She's British, and she came to Grenada on this mission to see Grenada acknowledging, of course, her family's role as a plantation owner. They owned 6 sugar plantations, and would have enslaved over 1,000 slaves in Grenada. So a visit was made to Grenada. There was a visit to the sugar plantations, those that remain today, as well as meeting with several historical persons in Grenada, visit to the UE Open Campus, and also dialoguing with the Reparations Committee here in Grenada, which is chaired by Ali Gill. He's the chairman of the Grenada National Reparations Committee. Hopefully one of these days we could have him on the program to talk more. And the vice chairperson is Dr. Nicole Philip Dow of that Grenada National Reparations Committee. So that story broke in 2022 about this interest in reparation. And to many Grenadians, this probably was the very first time that they heard that there was reparation, consideration of reparation that could be both symbolic in terms of a public apology, as well as compensation monies that could be received by those who, well, not those directly, but those whose families had played a role in the enslavement of our ancestors, our descendants, who were slaves on sugar plantations across the island. So next week, February 27th, the traveling family, I believe 7 members of the family, it may be more by the time they reach the island, but I believe reports are 7 members of the family will travel to Grenada to issue both a symbolic measure of reparation and also compensation. So just before we get into that, as I said, the family owned 6 plantations during the period of slavery and would have enslaved about 1,000 slaves. When slavery ended in 1833, the act was passed and freedom for slaves was achieved in 1834, and then eventually in 1838, the family received £34,000 from the government of Britain at time as compensation for the slaves because it was deemed loss of property. Slaves were considered property and property rights were to their owner, who were the plantation owners. So what the plantation owners were compensated for were loss of property because the slaves were regarded as property, not human beings, but property. So because of that, they got $34,000 in pounds as compensation, and today that money would probably be, well, that's the value. That has been told that the value of the £34,000 would be about £3 million EC today. That would be the value of the compensation that the traveling family would have received as compensation for the 1,000 slaves or property which they owned in Grenada. So as I was saying, getting back to the point here, so on Monday, February 27th, members of the family, the traveling family, they would be here in Grenada to, as I said, issue a public apology. The letter of apology has already been prepared and sent down, so you could go and read it online. So they have issued an official letter of apology acknowledging their family's involvement in the enslavement of Grenadians during the period of slavery. So that would be the first measure of reparation and apology. And also they will pay compensation. which would be the second form of reparation or restorative justice, is the payment of £1,000, which is about just under 400,000 EC dollars or 120,000 US dollars, would be paid to Grenada, and the money would be placed in a fund to be managed by the UE Open Campus, right? So that fund is intended for research and economic development. So some of the monies would go into doing further research on reparation, as well as some of the monies will also go towards economic development of Grenada. So that is going to be taking place next Monday at the Grenada Trade Center Annex, and it's going to be chaired by the Grenada National Reparations Committee, chaired by Ali Gill, and they have a committee members who'd be there. I guess government officials, etc., will also be there. And it's a very historic moment for Grenada, mainly because it would be the first official acknowledgement of some form of apology or role of let me rehash that statement. So it's gonna be the first official means of symbolic reparation, meaning the first apology directly from a family who was involved in slavery and the slave trade and the sugar plantations, to victims, because we are victims, our relatives and so forth are no longer alive today, so would be victims of descendants of slaves. So that is historic in itself. And also the compensation piece, it means that would become some kind of, well, basically some kind of revenue source to get monies that can be redirected towards more research that most likely can bring forward more families to pay compensation, or if Grenada wants to pursue its own legal case for reparation, tying into the broader Caribbean case being put forward for reparation. But to the monies that will help support the country economically. So it's very historic in that sense. It opens the doors to, as I said, more conversations and dialogue about the impact of slavery on Grenada, and of course, how can we be remedied by those who did commit those acts of violations to our ancestors. It does open more dialogue about that, and I really do hope that those involved, the Grenada Reparations Committee and other cultural and historical stakeholders, would have more dialogue with Grenadians as a whole about the impact of slavery on Grenada economically and socially, because there are both economic and social impacts on Grenada. And of course, this whole case of, do we continue to pursue more reparation monies from those families who were involved in slavery? So it is historic in that sense. So we're beginning a new era of talking about reparation. Long in the making, as I said, since 2013, the CARICOM has been pursuing this, but to date, Grenada is leading the way in terms of directly already benefiting from reparation monies and an apology. There has been a call by both Jamaica and Barbados for an apology by the church, and I think the church did a couple months ago issue an apology, But there's lots more on this, lots more on this. Some islands are pulling out of having a Westminster model with a governor general. Barbados did so last year, 2022, replacing the governor general with a president. And that's again, a little bit of it was because of this whole issue of the role of the British government in slavery, right? So there's a lot to unpack there in terms of as we move towards 2023 and beyond, what is done about reparation. So that's the program today in a nutshell. Just wanted to